What is up, guys? Random Name here. This is your fantasy LCS breakdown video for the 2017 summer split. In this video, I'm going to talk about everything you need to know for the summer split. And just as a disclaimer warning ahead of time, this video is not meant to be disrespectful to any player or any team. Obviously, all these players are phenomenal, but from a fantasy LCS perspective, there's got to be somebody who's the best, and there's got to be somebody who's the worst. So I have to speak in those terms. So even though all these players are great, some players you do not want to have on your fantasy LCS team, and it's nothing against them. It's just that they're not as good as some of the other players in the LCS. So please don't take offense if I say that your favorite player is not that good or that your favorite team is not that good. It's not intentional. It's just that I'm comparing, pro teams and pro players to each other. I'm not comparing them to plebs like us. So please don't take offense if I say something negative about a certain player or a certain team. Alright, so the big change to the LCS is that the EU teams that only play once in a given week will have their fantasy points doubled. And this basically means that the EU teams are now fantastic pickups again. So last split, you pretty much didn't pick up EU players unless they had 2 games that week. And it was just NA dominated. This split, EU players are definitely worth picking up in the draft phase. But the result of all of this is that the EU players are going to be higher risk but higher reward, right? Because if they do well in that one match that they have that week, then that amount gets doubled. But if they do poorly, they don't have any way to make up for that. So you're going to see much higher point values from the EU players and also much lower values from the EU players as well. We have 2 new teams in the EU LCS. So we have Ninjas in Pajamas and we have Mysterious Monkeys. The groups have remained pretty much the same, except that Ninjas in Pajamas has joined Group A, and then Mysterious Monkeys has joined Group B. I do think that, the hierarchy is going to stay kind of the same. G2 Fnatic Misfits are going to be your top 3 teams in Group A, and then Unicorns of Love, H2K, and Splice are going to be your top 3 teams in Group B. Alright, let's talk about some common fantasy mistakes that people make. So the most common one that I've seen is that people pick a player because of his skill, right? They're like, oh, this player's so good, I watched his stream, he's just phenomenal, I gotta have him on my fantasy team. And the truth of the matter is that the team determines whether or not a player is going to get a lot of fantasy points, not the player. So if you have a really good player on a not so good team, that really good player is not going to get a lot of fantasy points, and he is not a good fantasy pickup. Conversely, if you have a really strong team and they have a player that is kind of maybe an unknown player, or he maybe not be that good, he still will get a lot of really good fantasy points. So even though he may not be the top player within his role, if he's on a good team, he will get a lot of fantasy points. So just keep that in mind. The team is more important than the player from a fantasy points perspective. You want to pick up players who are on good teams, not necessarily pick up good players. Another common mistake, placing too high of a priority on a certain role. This kind of goes hand in hand with the third one, which is not adapting to the draft phase, right? You do not have to pick up 80 carry first pick. Like, you do not have to do that. Like, there are certain instances where picking up 80 carry first is advantageous. There are certain times where picking up mid lane first is advantageous. You need to look at what other people are picking, who is still available in the draft. This is especially important, in the 3rd, 4th, 5th rounds, where you have to be constantly looking at your options and adapting to what other people are picking. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more with the math that goes along with Fantasy LCS. But stay flexible, be adaptable in your draft phases. Do not go on autopilot, because you'll regret it. You'll wind up with a much worse team than you could have gotten. Another really common mistake is that people don't draft their flex players until really late in the draft. Like, they don't draft their flex players until they have starters in every other role. And a lot of times that's a mistake, because your flex player is going to have to get played every single week, and he will most likely get more points than team or support, or even maybe your top lane or your jungle. So it's really important that you pick up a backup mid laner or a backup AD carry early in the draft. Another one that I see a lot, I think I see at least one person in every single league do this, but they don't diversify among teams or regions. So you get this one guy, and all he picks is every single player from the same team. And basically what that does is it makes it so that he's super high risk and super high reward. If that team does great, then he wins. And if that team does poorly, then he loses. And that's not a very good strategy long term, in my opinion. I think that you should try to diversify your risk among multiple teams. I tried not to have more than 2 players from a given team on any of my fantasy teams. And then I also try to pick players from different regions, because you want to avoid times where players on your fantasy teams are playing each other, right? So G2 is never going to be playing TSM during the summer split. So if you can get G2 players, you can get TSM players, then you never have to worry about that. But you know, Cloud9 and TSM, they're going to play each other twice during the summer split. So if you have both Cloud9 and TSM players on your team, then that means that 2 of those weeks, some of your players are not going to get as many fantasy points because they're going to lose. Because one team has to win and one team has to lose in a given week. So definitely keep that in mind. You want to try and diversify your teams. You want to try and diversify your regions. Also, you want to diversify how much risk you take, right? You want to have some safe players and you want to have some risky players. I traditionally like to have safe players as my starters, and then I like to have risky players on my bench that I can sub in at different times depending on what the week is. And I'll often look ahead in weeks, and I'll figure out who's got a really strong, week 2 or a really strong week 3, and I'll try to draft players that I could probably sub in during that week that would be really favorable. And then the final one, which is not as important, is you want to try to avoid picking EU players within the same group because they play each other twice. If you can, you want to try and pick EU players that are in opposing groups. So if you've got a lot of G2 players, you don't want to pick up players within the same group as G2. You want to pick up players in the opposite group because they only play each other once in the opposite group. So anyone in Group A only plays the teams in Group B once, while they'll play everybody in Group A twice. So just keep that in mind. It's a minor thing, but if you can, try to split out your players into, Group A and Group B. So here's some math from the spring split, and this is basically a breakdown of every single role, how many points on average players in that role got, what the standard deviation was across the role, what the differences were between the top point scorers and the worst point scorers, and what's really kind of important are the colors here. So I kind of ranked every single role from first to sixth as far as the greatest difference. So you can see that mid lane is pretty much first across the board. You can see that top lane and support have a lot of second place finishes. And then jungle has a lot of third place finishes. And basically what this shows you is it's trying to show you what's the priority as far as your drafting is concerned. How much of a hit are you going to take if you don't get one of those top junglers, or if you don't get one of those top laners, or one of those top AD carries, right? So we're going to break down what exactly all this math means. So this is basically the exact same math. I just blew it up for you guys so you guys can see it a little bit easier. So traditionally, people think that AD carry is the most important role in the game, right? Everybody's like AD carry, AD carry, AD carry. Turns out that's not the case based on the math. Based on the math, mid lane is your most important role from a fantasy points perspective. Mid lane scores the most points on average at 16.88 points per game. They have the highest standard deviation, and they have the highest differences between players. What this means is that every single mid laner is important. Like, you want to get the best mid laner you can, because the difference between the best mid laner and the fourth best mid laner is a whopping 3 points. And if you compare that to AD carry, the difference between the best AD carry and the fourth best AD carry is only 1.28 points. So you can see that there's this massive disparity in mid laners. So you really want to prioritize your mid pick. Like, I would most likely pick my mid laner first in pretty much every single draft, unless like there just were not a lot of good mid laners left and I could get like a top ranked AD carry or something like that. But definitely, if you're like one of the first picks in the draft, you should be picking a mid laner. You should be picking a mid laner 100% of the time if you're like the first pick or the second pick in your draft. Let's move on to AD carry. So AD carry is the second highest point scorer in fantasy LCS. So 16.3 points per game on average. But they don't have a very high standard deviation. There's not that much difference between the best AD carry and, you know, the fourth best AD carry or the sixth best AD carry, or even the 10th best AD carry. Like, the difference between the first best, or the best AD carry and the 10th best AD carry is only 2.68 points per game. So basically what this is saying is that while AD carry is an important role because it scores a lot of points, you don't have to get that S tier AD carry. You don't have to, you know, get that first pick Sven or that first pick double lift. It doesn't matter as much because the point difference between AD carries is not that high. So you can get that fifth best AD carry or the sixth best AD carry, and it won't matter as much. So just keep that in mind when you're drafting AD carries. Like, yes, you want to get a good AD carry, but it's not going to ruin your team if you don't get, you know, the best AD carry. You can definitely survive with the fifth or the sixth best AD carry. Let's go on to jungle. Jungle is the third highest ranked as far as fantasy points are concerned. They average 15.73 fantasy points per game on average. But you can see that they got a pretty low standard deviation, pretty low differences. Particularly between the best jungler and the fourth best jungler. You can see the difference between the best jungler and the fourth best jungler is only 0.74 points per game. However, if you go from the best jungler to the sixth best jungler, it jumps up to 2.31 points. So what this is basically saying is that ideally you want to get one of the top 4 junglers on your team. So that's definitely a priority, is that you want to get a top 4 jungler on your team. But if you don't get a top 4 jungler on your team, then picking a jungler really doesn't matter. You don't have to prioritize a jungler after that, because the difference between the best jungler and the 12th best jungler is only 3.53 points. That's negligible, right? So keep that in mind. It's the difference between like the 6th best jungler and the 8th best jungler and the 10th best jungler is pretty much nothing. So if you don't get one of those top junglers, don't worry about it, and you don't have to pick a jungler early in the draft. Fourth highest as far as points are concerned is top lane. They average 15.13 points per game. So, you know, not bad, but not great. But what's really interesting is the differences when you get into the kind of the mid-range top laners. So the difference between the best top laner and the 6th best top laner is only 1.86 points. That's not a lot. But the difference between the best top laner and the 8th best top laner is 3.64 points. And that number keeps going up. So what this basically says is that it is essential that you get a top 6 top laner. So if other people in your fantasy draft start picking up top laners, then you have to pick a top laner very fast. Because if you get stuck with the 7th best or the 8th best or the 9th best top laner, that is much, much worse than having the 5th best or the 6th best top laner. So it doesn't really matter if you get the best top laner or the 6th best top laner, but you have to get somebody within the top 6. So just keep that in mind when you're drafting. Next, we'll talk about support. They're the 5th highest. They average 12.66 points per game, so definitely much lower than the other roles. That said, the difference between supports is really, really high. So the difference between the best support and the 4th best support is 2.51 points per game. So what this is basically saying is that while support does not get a lot of points per game, you really do want to get one of those top tier supports on your team, because the point difference is pretty huge, and that will have a pretty large impact as the season goes on, even though support doesn't get a lot of points per game. So you definitely want to get an S tier support if you can, and you may even want to prioritize, like if the top 4 junglers are taken, then you don't need to pick jungle, and instead you probably want to pick support, right? Because then you can get one of those top tier supports, and then you can pick jungle after that, and it won't really hurt your team as much or as badly as if you don't get a support and then you get like a mid-tier support. So just keep that in mind on how that can change your draft based on what other people pick. And then the final role that you can have is the team, right? So team averages only 12.03 points per game, which is the lowest out of any of the roles. And the deviation between the best team and the worst team is very small. So based on all that information, you really don't have to pick up your team. Like team is like lowest priority. So I would definitely pick up support before team. I'd pick up your flex pick before team. Might even pick up some of my bench picks before I pick up my team. So I think that this is a common mistake that people make, is they pick up the team way too early in the draft, and it really doesn't matter. Like what team you pick is pretty negligible compared to the other factors, the other roles that you can decide on. So just keep that in mind. That mid lane, super important. 80 carry, yes, high point scoring role, but the differences between the 80 carries is not that much. Jungle, you want to get a top 4 jungler if you can. If you can't, it doesn't matter as much. Top lane, you really want to get a top 6 top laner. Like that's super important because the difference gets pretty huge after that point. And then support, even though it's not a high scoring role, it is very important that you get a good support, because the difference between supports is pretty huge. Alright, so this figure, we're going to basically go through every single team. So you can see that the team on the left-hand side, and I've got every player on that team going across the row. The number next to each player or each team is their rank from 1 to 20. So you can see like TSM, I have them ranked 5th as far as team fantasy points are concerned. TSM is the best team in NA right now. I have them almost S tier across the board. I definitely feel like they don't score a lot of team fantasy points, and Svenskeren is definitely the weakest link on the team, and he does not score a lot of points from the jungle. But pretty much anyone else on the team is S tier. Cloud9, second best team, they're S tier across the board. Like not only are they a good team, but they put up a lot of fantasy points. The only person that I'm a little bit hesitant on is Impact, because he shares a lot of time with Ray. So even though Impact puts up a lot of fantasy points on a per game basis, he plays less games than other top laners, which could hurt his overall point scores. So that's why I've got stars around his name. Number 3 team, Phoenix 1. They're kind of a solid mix of S tier and A tier. The 2 S tier picks in my mind are Arrow and Inori. Though Inori has had visa issues in the past, he's had family issues in the past, and Meteos has been getting a lot of play time. So I've got stars around his name because I don't know if he's going to start. Like, I'm assuming he's going to start, but I can't be 100% sure that he's going to be starting every single game, which is why I've got stars around him. Number 4 team was FlyQuest, and FlyQuest actually did not put up that many fantasy points. They subbed out Altec for Wild Turtle, so that's the only roster change they had, which I think is an upgrade. But Wild Turtle doesn't usually put up a lot of fantasy points. He didn't put up a lot of fantasy points on TSM. And if he didn't put up a lot of fantasy points on TSM, then he's probably not going to put up a lot of fantasy points on FlyQuest. The team is really high focused, and Moon focused. So those are the two players that I'd probably pick up. Lemon also put up some decent fantasy points. He's actually a really great roaming support. He works really well with Moon and high shot calling in order to get deep vision and stuff. So those would be like the three players I'd be looking at FlyQuest to pick up. CLG definitely got an upgrade in the jungle from Dardoch. The issue is whether or not they can control Dardoch, because Dardoch is a very emotional player. When he plays well, he is one of the best junglers in NA, but he goes on tilt really easily, and his entire team suffers when he goes on tilt. So I definitely have my eyes on Dardoch and Stixxay. Those are definitely the two highest point scorers. Darshan has just not been playing that well. He really needs to improve because CLG really excels at that 1-4 split push, and they need to have a strong split pusher in order for that to work. But yeah, kind of overall, CLG is kind of A tier, B tier. Dignitas was another 5th, 6th place finisher. The only person that I'm really looking at on Dignitas right now is Someday. He put up some really decent fantasy points. Chaser could also jump up a bit. I feel like that Someday Chaser combo could be really lethal, but Chaser hasn't really shown anything. Hasn't really shown his potential yet. So I'm kind of hesitant on picking him up that early in the draft. Immortals is another one of those teams that's kind of, didn't really perform as far as from a fantasy points is concerned. And then Xsmithy, I feel like, is definitely a worse jungler than Dardoch, so I think that they're going to continue to struggle. There's nobody that I'd really pick up right away on Immortals. Echo Fox are the number 7 team, and even though they were the number 7 team, Acadian and Froggen put up a lot of really good fantasy points. So I feel like Acadian and Froggen are definitely two sleeper picks within this draft phase. They're definitely very good. I would say like a second jungler and a second mid laner that you could probably pick up pretty late in the draft. And then Team Liquid and Envy are the two worst teams. Lorlo is probably the only one that I would consider picking up right now. The rest, I would just kind of wait a little bit and just see how they perform in the first couple weeks. Moving on to the EU side, G2 obviously the best team in EU. Coming off of an amazing MSI performance. They're S tier across the board. Pretty much any G2 player you can get, you should pick them up. Unicorns of Love, the second best team in EU, and they put up a ridiculous amount of fantasy points, especially from top lane, jungle, and mid lane. They put up an absurd amount of fantasy points, and they also get a lot of team fantasy points. Samex and Hylissang did not get as many fantasy points as the rest of the team, which is why they're only A tier. But Visace, Xerxes, and Exile just put up a ridiculous amount of fantasy points, and you definitely should keep an eye on them. And I have a feeling that a lot of people are going to forget about those players. They're going to be too focused on G2, Fnatic, H2K, TSM, Cloud9, those type of players. And I think that Unicorns of Love is going to kind of fly under the radar in a lot of drafts. So definitely keep that in mind and try and pick up those players. Fnatic looked really good towards the end of the split. They did not put up a lot of fantasy points last split, but I think they're going to be a lot better this split. I feel like they're kind of a solid A tier, B tier kind of fantasy point team. You can pretty much pick up any of them as, I would say, probably as like a backup, in any single lane. And then from team points perspective, they also score pretty decent team points. So, they're good players across the board. So any one of them you can pick up, but I wouldn't pick them up very early in the draft. Misfits is another team that is kind of, solid A tier, B tier. They definitely have a worse jungler now. They had Cacao, now they have Maxlore. And I do think that's going to hurt them, right? Power of Evil and Hans Sama put up some ridiculous fantasy points on the spring split. I don't know if they're going to be as successful with Maxlore, so their stock has kind of dropped a little bit. And that also has to do with the fact that Fnatic is much better, and Fnatic and Misfits are in the same group. So because Fnatic is doing a lot better, and then Misfits is not as strong of a team, I feel like that's going to hurt. Both those two factors are going to hurt Misfits' fantasy point production. G2. H2K had a disappointing playoff run, but they were really strong in the regular season. Odo and H2K, or sorry, Odo and Yankos were really high point scorers, and yeah, those would be the two guys I would really focus on from H2K. They also put up a lot of team points, so they're definitely a good team to pick up. But those are the two I'd pick up. That said, Fevabin, Nuclear Shay are also all solid A tier picks. So definitely, if you can get those guys, they're solid players. So it's not like they're bad. It's just that if I could pick anyone from H2K, I pick Odo or Jankos. All right, Splice. Splice had kind of a disappointing split. I definitely think that they thought they were going to do a lot better than they did. That said, Wonder and Mickey X were S tier last split, and those two guys are going to be sleeper picks this split. So I don't think a lot of people are looking at Splice for fantasy LCS, but if you can, Wonder and Mickey X are definitely good picks for top lane and support respectively. A tier, Kabi and the team points, and then Trashy and Senkux kind of had a disappointing split, so I'd kind of probably hold off on them a little bit. And then the bottom four teams, Rocket, Vitality, Mysterious Monkeys, and Ninjas in Pajamas, I really can't recommend that many players on those teams because I don't think they're going to do that well. I definitely keep an eye on all those players and all those teams, but I would not initially draft those players. I'd wait until a week or two to see if they actually perform well. All right, so this is kind of the overall tier list organized for you guys, so you can see that I've organized them, and this is in order of best to worst. So I do think that I am ranking them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 all the way down. So Vivisace I would pick over Hanser. I pick Hanser over Wonder, etc., etc., etc. So we're gonna go over every single role and every single player. All right. So let's talk about the teams first. So my S tier for the teams are G2, Unicorn to Love, H2K, and Cloud9. Ideally, you want to get those teams. That said, we already saw that team points really don't matter. Teams scored that's kind of like the least important role to pick up. So if you don't get one of these S tier teams, it's not the end of the world. So just don't worry about it that much. But those are my S tier teams. A tier, TSM, Phoenix One, Fnatic, and Splice. Yes, TSM is a great team, but they don't put up a lot of team points, which is why they're only A tier. B tier, Dignitas, CLG, and Misfits. C tier, FlyQuest, Immortals, and Echo Fox. And then D tier is Rocket, Envy, Vitality, Team Liquid, Mysterious Monkeys, and Ninjas in Pajamas. So, just want to reemphasize, your team does not matter that much. So while you do want to get somebody in preferably an S tier or A tier, it really doesn't matter which team you get. For top lane, it's really important that you get one of the top 6 top laners, which is why I have 6 S tier top laners, and those are Vivisace, Hanser, Wonder, Xpec, Odoamne, and Impact. But the stars are on Impact because he shares time with Ray, so I would prioritize the other top laners over him, but he is an S tier top laner, so if one of the other S tier top laners is not available, I would pick up Impact. A tier would be Someday, Zig, Alfari, and Soaz. B tier would be Lorlo, Darshan, and Balls. C tier, Flame, Looper, and Seraph. Kind of interesting with Flame, Looper, Seraph. I think that these guys are all solid top laners, but they just haven't really performed up to their potential. So I am keeping an eye on those guys. But yeah, I definitely would not pick them up in the initial draft. And then D tier, Cabochard, Foxy, Jisoo, and Prophet. All right, moving on to jungle. So jungle, we saw that top 4 is super important, but after that, doesn't really matter that much. So if you don't get one of these S tier junglers, it really doesn't matter if you get an A tier or like a B tier or something like that. So just keep that in mind. Ideally, you want to get an S tier, but if you don't get S tier, you can see like there's not that much difference between a lot of these guys. All right, so S tier, Contracts, Xerxes, Yankos, Trick, and Honori. And then I've got the stars on Honori because he's had visa issues in the past, he's had family issues in the past, and we don't know if he's going to start or if Medios is going to start. A tier, Dardoch, Moon, Svenskeren, Acadian, and Broxa. B tier, Chaser, Trashy, and Maxlore. Maxlore is on Misfits. I do think Misfits is going to do well, but I only put him in B tier just because he didn't perform well last split, so I don't know how well he's going to do this split. D tier, C tier, Xmithy, Rainover, and Lyra, and then D tier, Joko, Pride Stalker, Llama Bear, and Shook. Moving on to mid lane. Mid lane, I already talked about it multiple times, so I'm going to re-emphasize it. Mid lane, super important. Every mid laner matters. So just keep that in mind. Like, you want to get the best mid laner you can. I think Jensen is the #1 pick. He should be the #1 pick in your fantasy draft. He's the highest point scorer in the spring split. But you definitely want to pick up a mid laner as soon as you can in the fantasy draft. My S tier mid laners are Jensen, Bjergsen, Exile, and Perks. A tier is Ryu, Fevemin, Power of Evil, High, and Froggen. I do think that people might sleep on High and Froggen, but they put up a ridiculous amount of fantasy points. You can see that both of them put up over 18 fantasy points per game on average, which is very high. I definitely think that especially Froggen, like, nobody's gonna pick up Froggen. So Froggen is a phenomenal pickup for your backup mid laner if some of these other guys are taken. B tier, Caps, Senkux, and Huhi. Caps, I feel like, could be, S tier or A tier. Everybody calls him, Baby Faker. But from a fantasy points perspective, he did not show it in the spring split. He actually had pretty low fantasy points in the spring split. I do think he's going to improve, but I'm not going to place him higher than B tier until I see him, actually perform. C tier, Keen, and Pobelter. These guys are decent, right? But they just, kind of lackluster right now. And then D tier, Golden Glue, Nuke Duck, Bexy, Pyrene, Cosq, and Nagni. Okay, finally 80 carry and support. So 80 carry, we saw that the difference between the best 80 carry and some of the lower ranked 80 carries was not that high. So if you don't get one of these S tier 80 carries, it's not the end of the world. That said, my S tier 80 carries are Sven, Double Lift, Arrow, and Sneaky. My A tier are Nuclear, Samex, Kabi, Stixay, and Hansama. Hansama actually scored a lot of fantasy points in the spring split, but because Misfits is weaker and Fnatic is stronger, I've put him a little bit lower on the list. I think he's going to not do as well this split as he did last split. B tier, Reckles, Wild Turtle, and Lod. I do think Reckles has the potential to be, obviously S tier, but he just hasn't shown it from a fantasy points perspective. C tier, Cody Sun, Piglet, Hajarnan. Piglet, kind of the same thing as Reckles. Obviously he's a great 80 carry, but he's not showing it from fantasy points. I don't think the meta really favors Piglet's play style, and he kind of has a lot of emotional issues. So that's why he's only C tier. And then D tier, Apollo, Keith, Steelback, Yuki 60, and Hiku. I'm hoping that I'm pronouncing these correctly. Okay, support. Finally, support. So we already talked about how support, yes, they don't score a lot of points, but the point difference between every single support is pretty huge. And you can see that, like Smoothie, almost 17 points per game, and you compare that with some of the A tier supports, which are only getting 13, 14, 15 points per game. So that's a pretty huge difference. So just keep that in mind. You want to trying the best support you can, and every support matters. So my S tier supports are Smoothie, Biofrost, Mithy, and Mickey X. A tier, Shay, Lemonation, Ignar, Hillsang, and Shady. Shady is new to LCS, but he is on Phoenix 1, which is a really good team, which is why I have him kind of A tier, because I think the Arrow is going to help him get a lot of fantasy points. B tier, Jessica, Afmaru, and Ollie. C tier, Big, Matt, and Gate. I don't know how Big it's going to do. He's the new support for Dignitas. And then D tier, Haku, Wadded, Vander, Dreams, and Spraddle. So that's my list, and I'm sticking to it. If you guys disagree with it, let me know. Let me know if I have some, if I don't have some intel that you guys have that proves that one of these players should be S tier or something like that. I'm happy with getting constructive criticism. But now all that that's done, I want to talk about one final thing, which is the fantasy leagues that I'm going to be doing this split, and it's kind of very short notice. So it's going to be first come first serve, and we're gonna get this stuff going. We're going to have 10 fantasy leagues this split. All leagues will be 8-man leagues. So I'll be in every single league. So there'll be a total of 70 people who can join the 10 leagues. All leagues will be first 2 game modes. So we won't be doing like the best game mode. We'll just be doing first 2 game modes, because I feel like that's a more consistent scoring method. And all leagues are going to be drafted on Wednesday, June 31st. That is tomorrow. I'm uploading this video on Tuesday. So tomorrow, Wednesday, we will be doing the draft. And the reason why we're doing that is because EU LCS starts on Thursday. So we have to finish all the drafts on Wednesday. So the drafts are going to occur every hour starting at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. That's 5 p.m. GMT. So we're going to have one fantasy league start at 10 a.m., one fantasy league start at 11 a.m., one fantasy league start at 12, one fantasy league start at 1 p.m., all the way until the last league that we're going to do is going to start at 8 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So pick which fantasy league you want to join based on when the draft is going to start. So do not sign up for a fantasy league where you can't make the draft. So pick the best time for you. I'm going to be doing a verbal ready check 5 minutes prior to the draft. So if you sign up for the 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time draft at 9:55 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, I'm going to ask everybody if they're there. So you need to type in the little chat box, ready, or I'm here, or something like that. If you do not respond to the verbal ready check, I will kick you from the league. I'm going to say that again because it's super important. If you do not respond to the ready check, I'm going to kick you. All right? You can avoid this if you talk to me before the draft starts. So you can either do that in the fantasy league chat. You can say, hey, I'm not going to be able to make the draft. Please don't kick me. I'm okay with my picks being automated, something along that fact. Or you can leave a message on this video, just basically saying, hey, I joined, this league. This is my username, and I'm not going to be able to, make the draft, or I'm just going to automate my picks. So please don't kick me from the league. And I won't kick you as long as you give me prior warning. But if you don't give me any prior warning, I will kick you from that league if you're not there. Any open spots we have in the league will be filled via a post on the league forums and Reddit. So I'll just go on, the fantasy LCS forums and Reddit and just say, hey, drafting ASAP, and it usually takes 5 minutes for people to sign up. And joining multiple leagues is allowed. So if you want to join 3 or 4 of my leagues, you can. But I ask that you please let other people have a shot at joining the leagues. So if you're watching this video right now, and you want to sign up for a league, just sign up for one to start, and then just wait a little bit. And then if a couple hours before the draft is going to start, there's still open spots, then you can sign up for multiple leagues, because there's only going to be 10 leagues. I've got like over 700 subscribers. Only 70 people are going to be able to join those leagues. So only about 10% of the subscriber base are going to be able to join. So I want to try and get as many people involved as I can. So, you are allowed to join multiple leagues, but give other people a shot before you join every single league that I have. Also, if all the leagues fill up, and you want to create your own fantasy league and you want to play with other subscribers, please do that. And you can post the link to the fantasy league in the comments below. I'm okay with that. I'll make sure that I check to make sure that it's not spam and things like that. But that is an acceptable way to find people to join your fantasy league. So if you have a fantasy league and you need more people to join your fantasy league, please put the link in the comment section below, and you can find other fantasy leagues that way if all of my fantasy leagues are filled up. So I'm sorry that I can't do 20 or 30 fantasy leagues, but I won't be able to manage all of them. So I'm gonna keep it to 10 with this split, and then I'll try to do more in future splits. So that's pretty much it for the video. If you have any questions, please leave a comment below. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up. It definitely helps the channel. And if you haven't subscribed yet and you've reached this far in the video, you should definitely subscribe, because I'm doing these fantasy videos every single week, and I try to respond to all of the comments that people make. So definitely subscribe if you haven't already. But I hope you all have a fantastic day. Good luck in all your fantasy leagues. This is Randomonium signing off.